So our first speaker this afternoon is Dr. Peter Fenwick. Dr. Fenwick is the consultant neuropsychiatrist emeritus to the epilepsy unit at the Maudsley Hospital, which he ran for 20 years. He is presently emeritus senior lecturer at the Institute of Psychiatry, King's College London. Dr. Fenwick has a long-standing interest in brain function and the problem of consciousness, and has published a large amount of research papers related to altered states of consciousness, near-death experiences, end-of-life experiences, and the process of dying. He has researched into meditation and continues to be interested in the relationship between meditative states, cognition, and brain function. Please welcome Dr. Peter Fenwick.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and I'd like to thank Sonia Doi very much indeed for inviting me here to talk. I talked in, I think it was Miami, at the second International Medical Spiritist meeting, and so I'm really pleased to be invited back. That's fantastic. So we're going to now talk about dying healed. Now you may say that is nonsense. Is it an oxymoron? An oxymoron is a phrase which means absolutely nothing. How can you die healed? Because if you were healed, you wouldn't be dying, would you? But in fact, what it means is to die in peace, you have to be emotionally and spiritually healed. So that's what I'm going to go into this afternoon. Death is a process with its own metric, and it's very important that we learn about it. Any of you not going to die? Oh, well. Then for heaven's sake, will you get yourself a map? Would you go through a Brazilian jungle and not have a map? But yet you're going to actually die, and I don't know how many of you have studied it. Here's quite a good map, The Art of Dying. And it will give you a good idea of the sorts of things that will happen. So you must, all of you, when you go home this evening, start learning about dying, because you don't know when it's going to happen. It might be any time. So there is said to be a symmetry between birth and death. Now I'm going to talk allegory for a moment, and you'll see later on while I'm doing it. It is said that at birth, the bad angel claims the soul as his, and you fall into subject-object consciousness, which I'll discuss in a moment. The good angel then lets go of the soul, and the good angel must fight for its return. And the good angel is non-duality. So we've got subject-object consciousness and non-duality. At death, the reverse is true. The bad angel has no use for the soul and gives it up. The good angel then fights to take back its divine possession. So this, in fact, is the hero's journey. You remember the knight who goes through the dark wood with a sword, cuts his way, kills the dragon, picks up the woman, and takes her home. Well, that, in fact, is essentially what this is about. So the hero's journey. So let's discuss these two fundamental levels of consciousness. And it's very important that you understand this, because the data on them is beginning to increase. Subject, object, consciousness, that's easy. You're a subject, you see an object, and you're conscious of it. So that is the level of consciousness that we're all in, unless any of you are awakened. Any of you awakened? Okay. Well, your group is subject-object consciousness. It's not surprising. So what is it? It's our everyday consciousness. There's a little voice in the head which talks, yeah? Says to you, don't do that, oh, you didn't do that well, all that sort of thing. We spend time in the future. We spend time in the past. So you're not around a lot of the time because you're either in the future or in the past. The future, in fact, is yet to come and probably will be different. And the past, of course, you can't do anything about, and even if you think about it, you can't remember it. Now, the other illusion we have is that we're in control and can do or choose things, which is a tricky one, but that's what we think. And we are attached to life and its suffering. Now, that last sentence is what you have to really understand about this level of consciousness. We are attached to things within life, and it brings suffering. So, most of us are in a state where we, in fact, are subject to suffering. But what about non-dual consciousness? That's different. There's no little voice in the head which talks. We spend no time in the future and no time in the past. We're just fixed in the present. We just are. And we cannot do things as the divine flows through us and manifests. So it is, in fact, a different state of consciousness altogether. And that is normally called awakening, or non-dual consciousness, or if we listen to Pim carefully, he's describing non-local consciousness. They're all synonyms for the same state of mind. Now, I'm going to talk to you about non-dual consciousness. What I want you to remember is the name of Jeffrey Martin. He's in San Francisco. He's collected about 1,500 people with non-dual consciousness. His argument is that it's much commoner than we think, so there are a lot of people on the planet who are awakened. You don't have to go up a Tibetan mountain or anything like that. You can find them next door. I was in a meeting the other day, and one of the chambermaids came in, and I could see she was different, so I asked her the standard questions. She got a little voice. Does she live in the present? And the most profound question is, are you deeply, deeply joyful? Don't use happy, joyful. In other words, there's a real happiness to it. And if you are happy and you answer those questions, you've probably awoken, and indeed she had. Now, this is Rupert Spira, and he's gone into non-dual consciousness. So I'm just going to play you a little clip of him. So could you roll the video, please? Okay, recording. Hi, could you give me your name?
Rupert Spira.
Rupert, thank you for coming along today. I'm going to ask you a little bit about the changes that have occurred to you. How do you experience reality now? How do you experience the world now?
My only knowledge of the world now is the current perception. In fact, I don't really know a world now. I simply know the current perception. And if I look to that perception and ask what is its substance, all I know is the experience of perceiving. I don't know a world out there that is perceived. I just know the experience of perceiving. And if I ask myself, what is the relationship of myself to this experience of perceiving, I find that they are utterly, intimately one and the same. I can't separate myself, and by myself I mean whatever this aware, knowing presence that I am is. If I ask myself, what is the relationship of myself, this knowing presence, to perceiving, that there is no relationship, there are not two things there, there is just the experience of perceiving.
Okay, so what he's saying is that there isn't an inside and an outside. There's no subject that knows. You're just there, locked in the present. And if we'd gone on with the interview, he would have told you that the present is absolutely beautiful and transcendent in the experiences that he has. So this gives you some idea of what it's like to awake at that level. Now, the next person I'm going to play you a clip of is Tony Parsons. Tony Parsons awoke, I suppose, about 7 years ago, something like that, and he teaches in London. And I'm just going to play you one little bit of him. And this is Tony when he was talking about love. And we understand, of course, that love is part of the non-local experience, part of non-duality. So this is what Tony has to say about it. Sorry, can you roll the video? Tony, I hope this will be my last question. Tony Parsons crossing the park, everything became fantastically beautiful. I'm very much aware of transcendent experiences, and I understand the way that love interpenetrates everything in the transcendent experience. When a liberation occurs, is it like that transcendent experience, or was that shadowed in some way?
Okay, what's interesting is that when awakening happens, and we're finding that with a lot of people because this is happening all over the place now with these talks, when an awakening happens, it seems like quite a contrast from what was apparent darkness. The darkness is dense and suddenly light enters it. Nobody experiences that, but there is a huge sense of love in that. And then thereafter, there's still some apparent darkness there. I have to say that when that finally collapses, the contrast is not so great, of course, because there already is light and only a residue of darkness. So the contrast in liberation isn't so great, but the love is absolutely apparent, but gentle and wondrous in a sweet, quiet sort of way. I mean, so I'm so sorry, that's the only way I can describe it. But of course it...
Okay, I'm sorry, I loaded one video over the other, but you can actually hear that and see what he says. In fact, there is this state of love which interpenetrates everything. Now, what can lead to a transformation before we die? Because I want to make use of these concepts of subject-object consciousness and non-local consciousness, or what we need to do is to find out what exactly predisposes you to them. Now, you've had a lot of figures today. There's a lot of information about mystical experiences, the peak experiences of Maslow and so on. And I've collected a lot of these myself. But that information is not actually going to help you on your deathbed. You're not going to say to yourself, oh yes, I remember so-and-so study, and X people went into transcendent consciousness. It's not that which is going to happen. What will happen is you'll be following your own consciousness as you approach death. So let's look at those things which may predispose you to an understanding of what the death process is. So spontaneous glimpses of awakening or consciousness beyond us, near-death experiences, and approaching death experiences. So let's start with a mystical experience. These experiences, if we have them, help us to die healed. Even if we don't have one ourselves, hearing about them reassures us that dying is not a fearful process. So we ought to learn about these states. So let's start with the spontaneous experiences. Now, this is a transformational spiritual experience, and it's Thetis Blacker. She is a religious and mystical artist. She had this experience when she was crossing a field at the age of 22. It's exactly the sort of experience that you would expect and you've read about in books. But I want you actually to listen to it, because this is maybe the final state that you will get into just before you die. So here's Thetis. Could you roll the video for us?
When I went and stood in the middle of the field, And then quite unexpectedly, as I stood right in the center of this field, I experienced something which one has to use the word vision because there isn't any other word. But one can't describe what I felt except really in analogous terms, that I felt the tongues of fire and the rushing wind, which I had read of in Pentecost, the Pentecostal experience of the apostles. Because although there was no rushing wind, the slight breeze brushed against my face, and it felt like something quite different. It felt like the rushing wind that one had read of in the Gospels, and the light of the nice sunny morning suddenly became like tongues of fire, because they weren't just ordinary light made up of rays and colors. They were vibrations of tremendous power. They were vibrations of light and love. And I found myself absolutely filled with this light. And as I looked around me, I saw that everything was sacred. Everything was absolutely filled, impregnated with this light, which was also what we have to use the word love for, because there is no other word. And I heard the birds singing, and I suddenly realized that the birds were completely made up of God, and that God, again an inadequate word, was in everything, and not only in everything, making everything that lived holy, but in the spaces between everything. And I realized that what we call God and what we call love was between all the atoms even. And then
So that is a really very good non-dual experience. And it contains light, enhanced meaning, everything holy, tongues of fire. But the most important thing for us, that all is a transcendent unity. And of course, there are no words to express this, because the experience is quite different from that of subject-object consciousness. So if you're lucky enough to have a transcendent experience, it's very important for you. And if you don't, it's helpful to look at other people's experiences. Now, shortly before she died, she and I had a pact. And the pact was that if she died first, she'd let me know and I'd visit her. And if I died first, I'd let her know, and she could visit, and she could visit me. In fact, I was in Japan at the time, and I got a telephone call from Setis saying that she was dying. Actually, it was obviously one of her relatives. And she died 2 days after I'd spoken to her. She told me that she was in her bed in the hospice, dying, and that rivers of golden light made up of love streamed through her room. So a most wonderful transcendent experience. The friend who was with her said that she lay back after that, very happy, very peaceful, and went forward to her death. So that's an important clue as to the mental states of those people who are approaching death. So next, let's take the NDE and see what it has to show us. Most of you will have read Ibn Alexander, Proof of Heaven, Meningitis, Mary Neal, Drowning, To Heaven and Back, Anita Morjan, Cancer, Dying to Be Me, and she was healed after it. And those are really good accounts of the mental states that you get into as you go through the NDE. And what I want you to do when you read those accounts is actually to think about them, because they do point towards the sort of mental state that you may be having when you die. So the non-dual world of the NDE is very important, and this is the deepest experience. The subject becomes pure energy. Now, he is in fact an air traffic controller, and he's a very screwed together guy, and he had one of the deepest NDEs that I know. And in it, he lost his body form, as you would expect. He became pure energy, and he was moving towards fusing with the universal energy of the universe. And it was at that point that he decided to come back. So I asked, well, I didn't, but the BBC asked him, because this is taken from BBC clip. The BBC asked him, what was it like? What have you got to tell us? And this is it.
I've got into the habit when I'm talking to my wife and knowing that I'm coming to do this. That's the answer. One. Not my finger. One. That's all there is. There is no you, there is no me, there is no God. You are part of, we are, everything. It's one. You're one part forever and ever. It changes. It wouldn't matter to me if the scientists are right, and they probably are, that the universe began from the Big Bang, from a singularity. It may or may not collapse back. It doesn't matter. It's one whole. We are part of it. It always has been, always will be. There is no creator. It's one.
That's one of the most refined non-dual experiences that I know. I think he went deep. So after a deep NDE, where you've experienced the universal, you obviously lose your fear of death and dying. So what else can help us? Well, end-of-life experiences. These are very important, and they occur in the period, usually about 3 weeks before you die. And what I wanted to do was to find out if the end-of-life experiences were like the NDE. So I went to the literature, and of course there was practically nothing on it. This is back in 2000. And so we set out to find the nature of end-of-life experiences, and we interviewed the carers of the dying. This was a 5-year retrospective, and a 1-year prospective study in England, Holland, and Ireland. The 110 carers questioned, 1 palliative care team, 2 English and 3 Dutch hospices, 1 nursing home, 1 Irish hospice, and the study by Dr. Una McColville. We had over 1,500 email accounts from the public, and we interviewed doctors, nurses, auxiliary staff, chaplains, and volunteers. So it was quite a comprehensive study. My colleagues were Sue Brain, Hilary Lovelace, Indika Kodam, and Dr. Una McColville. Now, the present consensus, the time that we got our data in to begin with, it was running at about 50 to 60%. It's now about 80% of those dying consciously will have an end-of-life experience. So you have a very, very good chance of having one of these experiences. I'm going to show you this. Those of you who were in Miami will have seen it. It's the dying process. It starts off with premonitions. They're very rare in our series. And then you come to deathbed visions. Remember, you're 3 or 4 weeks away from dying at this point. You actually can negotiate with your deathbed vision. And people are really happy when they see their deathbed visions. They change their language and they talk about going on a journey. Because one of the common things the deathbed vision tells them is that they're going to be picked up. And then, as you come closer to death, you enter a new reality. And this is really what the rest of the talk is going to focus on. It's this time just before death itself and what happens there. It's a fascinating period when you go into and come out of a transcendent reality, and you gradually begin to learn what it's like. Then, of course, you die, and you get deathbed coincidences when the dying person will go and give a message to somebody who they're very close to. And the form the message takes will depend on the mental state of the person who receives it. If they're awake, it will be a very strong feeling that something has happened to this person. And if you're asleep, you'll then get a narrative dream. The person will come to you in your dream, usually then become surrounded by light. They'll give you a message, which will usually be, "I'm okay, please don't worry." And then they'll go, and you know that they've died. In our sample, 40% of the people didn't even know that the person who had visited them was ill before they came. So it's not expectation, it's something else rather more profound than that. Then you die, and it's a magical time, it's a non-local time. It's when many non-local things are happening. Clocks stop, we've got good accounts of those. Animals are disturbed by your death, your animals. Bells ring in the hospice, shapes are seen leaving the body, their presence is in the room. All these are essentially non-local effects. And there are also light in the room as well. So this is all the loosening of consciousness, and it's the actual process of death itself. So what does this moving to new realities really look like? This is a very good paper by Monica Renz in Switzerland. And I'd very much recommend, this is the paper, but I'd recommend her book to you. Moving to a new reality is experienced by 60 to 70%, but that has now gone up to 80, almost 90%. So all of us probably will have it. And what's it like? It's very like the NDE world, the sort of world which I've described to you. Light, love, and compassion abound, wholeness and feelings of unity. It's a waiting area with spiritual beings, and dead relatives are present. So the people who come, and in our study, it's usually your parents or your siblings, grandparents, friends are right down the list, and right at the bottom, I'm sorry for all you cat and dog lovers, they may be there, but usually they're not. So this is the quality and nature of the reality. There's Monica's book, Dying a Transition. Do get it. It's a very good map of what may happen. I'd like to go on and use her classification, which is 3 phases in dying, but we're in this place particularly. It's pre-transition, transition, and post-transition. And again, I think you ought to know about this. Pre-transition, the patient may feel needs, pain, and emotions and joy. It's probably 1 week before you die, so you have needs. You may fear losing control and dignity and realize dying is inevitable. From that statement, you can tell exactly what level of consciousness you're in. You're in subject-object consciousness. So this is a description of most of us who die in subject-object consciousness. You come to this terrible feeling that dying is inevitable. And what effect does that have on you? Of course, you realize that you have to go with the process, but more than that, you realize that you're locked, that you are, in fact, locked where you are, and you're not going out, and this is the end. Now, patients can be locked in the pre-transition due to denial. So do remember this. You may not get any further than this, and so I would recommend that you study your maps before you go. You reactivate traumas, very important. Anxiety, struggle, and strong attachment of unresolved family distress. So these are all features, in fact, of subject-object consciousness. So the blocks are denial, reactivated traumas, anxiety, struggle, and strong attachments, and awareness of previous negative behavior. So these need to be cleared by you, and it's better if you can clear it before you go into this process than when it actually occurs. I thought I would show you this slide. It is, of course, Syria. And just to remind you that we have in our culture now people who have been to Vietnam and fought there, people who have fought in the war in Afghanistan and in Iraq. These people, many of them, will have quite severe traumas which they experienced during that time. And so dying can, in fact, be difficult if you've had a lot of traumas. And remember that although you think that this is somebody else who behaves like this, also there is a component of yourself which can behave like that. But very few of us do. So support and release, such as finding meaning, may help patients to move on. So that's pre-transition. Transition itself implies the loosening of ego consciousness. Well, as I said, we're in subject-object consciousness. Patients typically show physical signs of anxiety and struggle. Body may convulse, may sweat. Some patients simply stare and are restless. Traumas are reactivated, and I've described that. Some may experience transition into symbolic scenarios such as apocalyptic fights. So transition can be very quick, and you go into non-dual consciousness, or it can be rather longer. Now we come to post-transition, and this is the spiritual opening. The ego is not dominant anymore, so you're in non-symbolic consciousness. Patients seem to be serene, in a state of being beyond anxiety, pain, or powerlessness. Now you're having a really good death. Most are unable to speak, but can still hear. They communicate by gestures or single words. Sometimes reconciliation, vision, and peace are observed. So a lot of them are very, very tranquil. Such transformative experiences may be comparable to spiritual awakening or a patient who has completed the journey. So if you can all get your spiritual awakening before that, have a go. Now, what I'm going to do is show you some quotes from our study of people who were in that state. So, perception of the new reality. Suddenly she stared intently up at the window. This lasted only minutes, but it seemed ages. She suddenly turned to me and said, "Please, Pauline, don't ever be afraid of dying. I've seen a beautiful light, and I was going towards it. I wanted to go into that light. It was so peaceful. I really had to fight to come back. Sadly, she died the next morning, but I knew she had seen something that day which gave her comfort and peace when she knew she had only hours to live." So that's a very, very clear account of somebody who's in non-dual consciousness. Here's another one from Italy. Remember, Italy is a hot country, and if people are dying, it's sometimes very, very helpful to have a gauze put over your face, which is in fact damp and wet. Keeps you cool. Adriana, my dear, your mother, who has died 3 years before, is helping me to break out of this disgusting body. There is so much light here, so much peace. Again, somebody who is moving into and acquiring non-symbolic consciousness. Here's another one. My father was at his bedside, my grandfather's, deeply distressed, but my grandfather quietly said to my father, "Don't worry, Leslie, I am all right. I can see and hear the most beautiful things, and you must not worry." And he quietly died, lucid to the end. So again, he'd made the transition successfully. And this is the last one. I was nursing my friend who had definite views that there was no afterlife. And I take the view of Mary de Hensel, who was the first psychologist in the first Paris hospice. And she said, it's not dependent on your beliefs, it's dependent on the life you led. So if you think of that, then the quality of the life you lead is what will define what happens during death, not what you passionately believe. I was nursing my friend who had definite views that there was no afterlife. In her last couple of hours, she became very peaceful, And so you can see that she's already made the transition and arose from her unconsciousness periodically saying clearly and happily such phrases as, "I'll know soon, come on, get on with it then. I'm ready to go now." And it's so beautiful. She would immediately lapse back into unconsciousness after uttering these phrases. She's very obviously content, happy and at peace. It was a wonderful experience for her partner and me. So that gives you some of the feeling of what it's like once you have arrived at the transition. Now, I thought I'd give you a practical example because it happened in the last few weeks. An old friend of mine, Professor Paul Robertson, Paul had an NDE, and then he, in fact, as I say, died a few days ago. There's Paul, he's leader of the Medici Quartet, highly intelligent, very sensitive, lovely guy. And he had an aortic aneurysm, this is about 5 years ago. And during a half-hour operation to repair a tear in his aorta, Paul was under general anesthetic and unconscious. His heart was stopped and his head cooled to prepare his brain for a period of brain oxygen starvation. In his book, Paul describes very clearly what he experienced while in this deeply unconscious state between life and death. Now, I interviewed Paul after this talk about his NDE, and again, we had the same bargain. If I died first, he'd be with me and I'd be with him. This is his book, which I'd like you all to read, Soundscapes, A Musician's Journey Through Life and Death, by Paul Robertson. It's a very good account of an NDE, and the way that the NDE, in his case, can lead to clearing, so that by the time you come to dying, you're clear and ready for it. After his NDE, he found his understanding of the world and beyond fundamentally changed. So if you have time, do read that book. Now, this is what he said happened in his NDE. He was, he says, fully aware that he was dying and moving from this state to experience of the potential unification of his consciousness with that of the universe. Well, you've heard that before. But listen to his words. As I lay there waiting, I felt myself die beautifully, ecstatically, transcendently. I saw eternity and shed the whole of myself joyfully in order to become unified with it. So those are amazing words, beautifully, ecstatically, transcendentally. So why in these circumstances did Paul come back? And again, this is another lesson for it, because his family pulled him back. And how did they do that? They went in every day, as good family members will. They played him sounds of the Medici Quartet. They sang to him, prayed to him, asked him to come back. And he felt that they weren't yet ready to let him go. And so, in fact, he came back. So, when Paul actually died some weeks ago, his wife and family were with him. In fact, I'd seen him on the morning before his death. His wife told me what happened shortly before he died. Paul woke up slightly from a deep sleep and told me I must let Peter Fenwick know that there is nothing new. We've all been there before. Now, there are two interpretations of that. One is the nothing new, is how we had discussed together what the transcendent is and the crossing is. And the other is that he feels that it's part of a much wider metric of life, in fact, and that we've all been within that state at some time. So I think that's a very good account, but I'd like to also show you the magic of dying. Here you see a feather. There it is on the bed. And into the room as Paul died came a blackbird. Now there's a huge association of birds and the moment of dying. Many of the accounts we've heard is that the people who die feel that the birds in somehow are related to the spirit of the dying person. And not only did the blackbird come into the room, but he left this feather for us to see. And I don't think you can see it, I certainly can't from here, but there's a patch of light there on the bed, an undulating patch of light. We've got a little video of that, which came in at that time. So what do blackbirds mean? Well, I have no idea what blackbirds mean. So you go to Google, and what do they say? It's considered a symbol of the human soul and symbolizes intelligence, wisdom, and joy. I thought that was rather nice. Of course, it's different in different cultures, and I must agree to a little bit of choosing the one I thought fitted best. But I think that's rather nice. So please be aware of the magic of things which happen when you die. There are a lot of non-local experiences, and we need people to do more studies and describe these. And there's Paul, after he'd been ill and after his illness, and he never expected even to walk or speak again. But here you see him playing shortly before his death. He got enormous perseverance. Okay, so let's go back to the final transition again. I hope you have a feeling for it now. It's the crumbling of the ego. It's gone. There is, in fact, nothing that you can, in fact, do. You have to, by this time, I hope you've cleared yourself and you're lying in non-symbolic consciousness. And this is the time when subject-object consciousness transforms to non-symbolic consciousness, and all is a divine unity. Now, maybe some of you will have made the crossing before, but you'll certainly die more easily if you did. So what's a good death? Dying healed, obviously. A good death simply means a peaceful death, the opportunity to talk about fears they may have about dying, or if they have had end-of-life experiences, to have them validated. The ability to choose the time to die, either alone or with family present, and do remember that, because you can hold the people, your family member who's dying back by wanting them to stay and not go, and it's difficult for the person who's dying. So be very quiet and positive with them. And you want the chance to settle unfinished business and say farewell. So if there are family rifts, for heaven's sake, make sure that before they get to this point, obviously, they are in some way moderated. So this is reconciliation, really. And I like this one, and I hope you like it. My father and I had never got on. I'd left home at the age of 16 and never gone back. One day, on my way to work, I had a sudden need instead to head north for home. When I arrived, Mum came rushing out in tears. My father was dying of cancer, and they had not been able to get in touch with me. I made my peace with my dad, who said now he had seen me, he was ready to go, and he died that night. And I think that's a lovely example of the clearing and the resolution of the dying process, which takes you through into non-symbolic consciousness and into actual death itself. So we come back to where we started from, the good angel and the bad angel. I hope the good angel in your cases will in fact have managed non-symbolic consciousness before you go into the dying process, but if it hasn't, it doesn't matter, because you'll have your opportunity then. So remember, it's the hero's journey, and that the going into the dark wood with your sword and slaying the dragon is in fact clearing yourself and clearing your psychology so that you're free and not trapped in pre-transition and can go right through to transition. And there you are, your lovely transcendent self by itself as you die and go in to the other reality that by then you'll already be familiar with. With the giving up, the ego lets go, the ego structures crumble, and the transcendent shines through. But here's a health warning. Merrill Wolfe, I don't know how many of you have read Merrill Wolfe. He's a Stanford professor, and he awoke. He had a very deep awakening. And if you read his book, some of which is easy to read and some very difficult, but in it he states that if you don't awake before you die. And in fact, he might have added, if you don't awake when you have died, then you have to come back around and try again. Of course, this is very much the Buddhist philosophy as well. So, thank you very much, and thank you for your attention.